What happens when daytime TV's most unfiltered host squares off with one of America's most controversial conservative voices? And what if that confrontation explodes on live television in front of millions? Welcome to the broadcast that would become one of the most talked about moments in modern media history. The morning began like any other taping of The View. The audience filtered in early, buzzing with anticipation. The set glowed under soft studio lights, crew members shuffled around adjusting mics, and producers whispered in tight circles. On the docket, hot-button topics, the latest political controversies, and a guest appearance from conservative firebrand Steven Crowder. The atmosphere was already charged, not unusual for The View, but today had a different energy. Crowder was no stranger to provocation, and pairing him with a panel known for its progressive stances was like inviting gasoline to a match. Backstage, Whoopi Goldberg was calm but focused, her signature sunglasses resting on the table beside her tea. Beside her, Sunny Hostin reviewed her notes, Joy Behar rehearsed a few biting remarks under her breath, and the executive producer paced nervously, clearly aware that today could turn volatile. Crowder arrived late, flanked by his team, wearing a smug grin and a blazer that screamed, "I'm ready to go to war." Before stepping onto set, he leaned toward a staffer and muttered, "Let's give them something to talk about." And he would. What began as just another episode would spiral into a national spectacle that forced producers to cut to commercial, divide the audience, and ultimately remove Crowder from the stage. But the sparks didn't start with yelling. They started with a smile and a question. And from there, it all unraveled. Steven Crowder's entrance was calculated. As the cameras began to roll, he stepped onto the View stage with the confidence of a man who thrives on confrontation. He wore his usual smirk, waving to the audience as if he were stepping into friendly territory, not the lion's den. The applause was polite, somewhat forced perhaps, but Crowder fed off it anyway, flashing a quick wink at the crowd. Across the table, Whoopi Goldberg's posture stiffened. She knew what was coming, everyone did. The segment began cordially enough. Whoopi opened with a rehearsed line about hearing all sides of the political spectrum, but the tension was palpable. Crowder responded with faux warmth, thanking the hosts for bravely having someone with a dissenting opinion. Joy Behar rolled her eyes. Sunny Hostin gave a tight smile. The first topic was scripted, gun rights. Crowder leaned in. "Let's talk facts," he said, "not feelings." The tone shifted instantly. The audience murmured, sensing this wouldn't be the standard daytime fluff. The hosts weren't rattled, not yet, but their smiles faded. Everyone at the table understood. Crowder wasn't here for conversation, he was here for combat. What no one expected, though, was just how far he'd push. Whoopi asked a pointed but respectful question about gun violence and community trauma. Crowder interrupted. "Well, Whoopi, when you live in gated Hollywood mansions, maybe crime statistics feel like abstract art." A few gasps rippled through the audience. The tension ratcheted up. Whoopi raised an eyebrow but didn't respond right away. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, letting the silence hang. The studio was hushed. Crowder had made his first move and he knew it landed. But what he didn't know was that Whoopi was just getting started. And once she responded, the interview would take a sharp turn towards something no one could control. Sunny Hostin tried to pivot. With a steady voice and journalistic calm, she shifted the conversation toward the Second Amendment's historical context. "Steven," she began, "when the founders wrote the Constitution, they weren't thinking of semi-automatic weapons in every home." Crowder didn't blink. "They also weren't thinking of abortion clinics on every corner," he fired back. The audience recoiled, some audibly. Joy Behar's mouth dropped open. Even Whoopi seemed momentarily caught off guard. The producers in the control room hovered over the mute button, but they were already behind. Sunny pressed forward, determined not to be baited. "I'm asking for a good faith discussion," she said, her voice slightly tighter. "But if you're going to weaponize every topic, we're going to have a problem." Crowder leaned in closer, eyes fixed on her. "Maybe the problem is this show treats conservative voices like intruders, not equals," he said. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Sunny's posture shifted. "No, Steven," she replied with steel in her tone. "The problem is when you confuse provocation for principle." The crowd murmured again, some clapped, others groaned. The temperature on stage was climbing. What had started as ideological friction was turning personal. Crowder could sense the tension and thrived in it. Sonny, ever composed, gave one final warning. "We invited you here to speak, but if you're going to play games with people's trauma, we'll end this conversation ourselves." Crowder smirked, then took a long, theatrical pause. "That sounds a lot like censorship," he said, looking to the crowd for support. But the audience was now split. The laughter was thinner, the applause uneven. Whoopi tapped her cards against the table. "Let's not pretend we don't know what's happening here," she said, voice low. "He came here to start a fire." And the smoke was just beginning to rise. Whoopi Goldberg didn't wait for the next question. She tossed the cue cards aside and leaned in, elbows on the table, gaze locked on Crowder. "Let's stop dancing," she said. "You believe your version of America is the only valid one, but this country isn't just yours." Crowder grinned like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. "I don't think it's mine," he replied. "I just think it's worth defending from people who want to tear it apart." The audience gasped again, this time louder. The studio lights may have been bright, but the temperature in the room dropped. Joy Behar jumped in, voice sharp. "Defending it with what, fear and arrogance?" she snapped. Crowder turned to her with a mock innocence. "Defending it with facts and backbone, Joy, two things this show rarely tolerates." The audience groaned, some booing, others clapping in defiance. The table had lost its center. Sonny attempted to moderate, hands raised slightly, but Crowder wasn't done. "Let's talk about faith," he said, veering off topic. "You can mock Christian values all you want, but they built this country." Whoopi's chair creaked as she sat up straighter. Her tone turned from sharp to stone cold. "Don't you dare tell me what built this country," she said. "My ancestors built it, brick by brick, while yours were writing manifestos about liberty and ignoring slavery." It was the first true explosion. Crowder's smile vanished. "That's not fair," he said, voice harder now. "I didn't come here to be vilified for my skin color." "You came here to provoke," Whoopi replied, calm but cutting. "And now that it's uncomfortable, you want to play victim?" The crowd was no longer divided. They were stunned. Silence swept the studio. The crew in the wings exchanged glances. This wasn't just ideological sparring anymore. It was something deeper, raw, and dangerously real. And there were still 4 segments left on the schedule. With the audience hanging on every word, Whoopi Goldberg leaned forward and dropped her voice to a low rumble. "You know what I don't appreciate, Stephen?" she said, slow and deliberate. "You walking onto this stage pretending this is a fair fight, when you showed up with brass knuckles hidden in your smile." Crowder tilted his head, visibly annoyed. "I'm not here to play your victim-villain narrative," he replied. "I'm here to challenge the lies you push under the guise of daytime civility." That did it. The crowd erupted. Shouts, gasps, a wave of tension pulsing through the room like a tremor. Whoopi didn't flinch. "You want to talk about civility?" she shot back. "Then stop interrupting women every time they push back on your nonsense. You call that discourse?" Crowder threw up his hands. "Ah, there it is. He disagrees, so he's sexist." Classic. He turned to the audience. "This is the trick. Frame every disagreement as oppression." But the audience wasn't fully with him anymore. Some were nodding, but others had crossed their arms, growing visibly uncomfortable. Behind the cameras, the floor producer whispered to a stagehand, "Get ready for a break." Everyone could feel it spiraling. But Whoopi wasn't done. She planted her elbows on the table and stared Crowder down. "You don't get to come here, talk down to us, and then act shocked when someone calls you out." Crowder's jaw tightened. "I call things how I see them," he said, "and what I see is a show that doesn't want a real debate. It wants submission." That was the moment the control booth flashed a silent cue. Commercial in 5. But they were already too late. The temperature had soared past the breaking point, and someone was about to boil over. The moment the show returned from commercial, the atmosphere was different. The music played, the lights reset, but the tension didn't dissipate. Crowder was no longer grinning. He leaned forward, his tone sharpened like a blade. "Let's get one thing straight. He began, voice cold and clear. I didn't come here to be talked over by a table of activists masquerading as journalists. Whoopi held his stare, unmoved. And we didn't bring you here to audition for your next YouTube rant, she replied. The crowd cheered, but it wasn't the full-throated support the hosts usually enjoyed. The room was splitting down the middle. Crowder pointed at Whoopi, then Sunny. You keep saying I'm not listening, but every time I try to finish a sentence, you jump in with moral outrage. He turned to the crowd. That's not a discussion, it's theater. Joy Behar interrupted him mid-sentence. Oh, please, Stephen. Don't pretend you're some poor truth-teller being silenced. You came in with your script. Blame minorities, defend guns, cry censorship. Crowder's face flushed. I came with data, Joy. Maybe try reading some instead of parroting Twitter threads. That line hit hard. Joy slammed her hand on the table. Don't you dare talk to me about facts while you peddle conspiracy nonsense to your followers. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The studio lights hummed in the background. Then Crowder shifted gears. You want real? He asked. Let's talk about the breakdown of families, about kids being raised to hate their country, about media elites sitting in studios pretending to understand working-class pain. Whoopi's tone dropped low, almost dangerous. You don't get to define pain, she said, not when your idea of patriotism is turning a blind eye to injustice. Crowder didn't blink. And you don't get to pretend outrage is wisdom. That was the moment the director muttered into the headset. We're losing him. This is going to blow. And they were right. The moment the next segment veered off course, producers hit the button. Cut to commercial. But the fire on set didn't cool. The studio's house band tried to play over the tension, but it rang hollow. Crowder was mid-rant as the cameras officially powered down, but behind the scenes they kept recording. This is exactly why people don't trust the media, he barked, gesturing around the table. You invite me here and then ambush me. This is a hit job with craft services. The hosts were silent, their microphones muted, but their faces said enough. Whoopi tossed her cards aside, stood slowly, and leaned across the table. Not out of anger, but out of sheer disbelief. You're not some whistleblower, Stephen. You're a brand. And you're playing the villain because you think it sells. Crowder clapped once. At least I'm honest about it. This place runs on outrage. You just pretend it doesn't. Sunny Hostin looked directly into camera 2, which was still rolling. We asked for a civil discussion. You walked in here like it was a wrestling promo. One of the producers darted across the set, whispering something urgently to Whoopi, who shook her head. Number, if he wants to play, we finish it right here. The audience was in a half murmur. Some people clapped. Others looked toward the exits, unsure of whether they were witnessing a breakdown or a setup. The studio's director leaned into the control mic. Don't kill the feed yet, he said. Let it ride. Crowder stood now, pacing behind his chair. You're not used to someone pushing back, he said. You think I'm going to back down because I'm outnumbered? He turned back to Whoopi. I'm not afraid of this table. She stepped back into frame, arms crossed. Then sit back down and prove it. And against all odds, he did. But it was far from over. While the audience remained riveted to the chaos on stage, the real storm was brewing just behind the curtain. In the control room, producers scrambled between camera feeds and damage control strategies. The executive producer, jaw clenched and headset buzzing, barked into the mic, Do we pull him now or let it play out? No one answered. The floor director paced near the side of the set, waving off interns who tried to intervene. If we yank him mid-sentence, he'll make it 10 times worse, one assistant whispered. But if we let this keep going... The sentence never finished. Backstage, a production assistant raced to Crowder's team. We need him to dial it down, just a bit, or we're going to have to end the interview. Crowder's manager barely looked up from his phone. Let him finish, he said coolly. He's just getting started. Meanwhile, Sunny's assistant whispered in her ear, warning that certain advertisers were already pulling clips. You go back out there, she said. You hold the line. And she would. But it was Whoopi's voice that producers feared the most. She had gone off script, ignored direction, and now stood like a general on the front lines. There was no turning her down. In a quiet corner behind the set, one junior editor hovered over the live feed with a growing sense of dread. "This can't air as is," he muttered. "It'll be a bloodbath." But the senior producer just shook her head. "It's already airing," she replied grimly. "The internet's watching live." On-screen, Crowder and the hosts had returned to their seats, but they weren't calmer, just colder. Every word now was a sharpened edge, every pause a standoff. And behind the curtain, one producer muttered the truth everyone knew, but no one wanted to say, "This isn't an interview anymore, it's a takedown." The cameras snapped back to life, but the air on set was ice. No music played, no cue cards moved, no one smiled. The host sat upright, composed, but electric with fury. Crowder, now seated again, folded his arms like a man daring the room to flinch. The audience clapped politely when prompted, but the sound was weak, half-hearted. Everyone in the room felt it. Something irreversible had shifted. The charm of daytime television had vanished, replaced by a silent tension that gripped every corner of the studio. Whoopi was the first to speak, her voice low and clipped. "Welcome back," she said, eyes locked on the camera. "For those just joining us, we've been having a spirited discussion." Crowder chuckled under his breath, but no one joined him. Joy Behar kept her arms crossed. Sunny Hostin flipped through her notes without looking up. "We brought Stephen here today to talk about his views," Whoopi continued. "But let's be real, this isn't about views anymore. This is about respect. Or the lack of it." Crowder's smile faded. "Is that your way of saying I should apologize for disagreeing with you?" he asked. "Because that's not happening." The silence that followed was suffocating. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about posture, tone, intent. Crowder had arrived armed for debate, but he'd turned it into a war zone. The panel, once known for sharp questions and sharper comebacks, now sat like a jury. "Stephen," Sunny finally said, carefully, "we don't fear debate. But we do recognize when someone comes not to engage, but to antagonize." Crowder leaned in. "Maybe if your side listened more and lectured less, you'd know the difference." It was a line meant to score points, but there were no points left to win. Only fallout. Joy Behar didn't wait for the next pivot. She slapped her hand on the table and turned fully toward Crowder. "You know what's exhausting?" she said, her tone thick with venom. "People like you coming on this show pretending to speak for real Americans while mocking everyone who doesn't parrot your ideology." Crowder raised an eyebrow, his voice calm but edged. "You mean Americans who don't live in your Manhattan echo chamber?" The audience reacted. A few laughs, a few groans, but Joy didn't flinch. "I've been doing this show for over 2 decades, Stephen. I've seen grifters come and go. You're not new, you're just louder." The comment hit. Crowder leaned back in his chair, visibly bristling. "You call yourself a comedian, right?" he snapped. "Because it's getting hard to tell if this is satire or just delusion." Joy's lips curled into a smile, sharp, knowing. "Oh, honey, I stopped trying to make people like you laugh a long time ago." The audience erupted, but Crowder didn't blink. He wasn't here to win the crowd. He was here to leave scorched earth. "Keep laughing," he muttered. "That's what elites do when they've got nothing left but condescension." The word elite hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Whoopi tried to redirect, but it was too late. The air was no longer tense, it was hostile. Joy leaned in again, her voice low. "You came here thinking you could hijack our platform and bully your way through a segment. But this isn't your podcast. This is our table." Crowder didn't respond immediately, he just stared at her, then turned to the crowd. "This table doesn't want a conversation," he said. "It wants a confession." And in that moment, it was clear. The gloves were off. The final cracks were forming and someone was about to be shown the door. Stephen Crowder's composure finally cracked. He slammed his hand on the table, not hard, but enough to jolt the studio out of its breathless silence. "This is a setup," he said, voice tight with fury. "You invited me here to get ambushed by a firing squad of leftist talking points dressed up as morning banter." Whoopi exhaled deeply, hands clasped on the table, her expression unreadable. "You agreed to the interview, Stephen. No one forced you into that seat." Crowder pointed at her. "Yeah, and I did it in good faith. But clearly that was a mistake." The audience stirred again, a mixture of nervous laughter and murmurs. Sonny Hostin's voice cut in, calm but pointed. You think being asked to explain your views is a setup? That's not ambush, it's accountability. Crowder turned to her, teeth clenched. Number. That's you twisting every word I say into a headline before I've even finished my sentence. Joy Behar laughed dryly. You think this is bad? Try being a woman on national television for 20 years. You wouldn't last one season. The crowd applauded. Crowder didn't join. His eyes burned with indignation, his fists curled tightly on the table. The room had shifted from combative to combustible. Whoopi leaned forward again, slow and deliberate. Let me ask you something, Stephen. What exactly did you think was going to happen when you came here? Crowder shook his head. I thought we'd debate like adults. I didn't expect to walk into a trap. She held his gaze. Then maybe you don't know this audience as well as you think. That line landed hard. Crowder sat back stunned, silent for the first time. But the tension in the studio had reached its ceiling, and off camera, 2 security guards had quietly taken their positions, just in case. The sight of security edging closer wasn't lost on anyone. They stood just beyond the cameras, hands folded, eyes locked on Crowder. He noticed. What's this? He said, gesturing toward them. Am I being threatened now because I dared to speak? Whoopi remained calm. No one's threatening you, she said. But when you start flipping tables in people's living rooms, don't be shocked if they show you the door. The studio audience murmured, the tension thick enough to cut. Crowder stood, pushing his chair back just enough to make a statement. I don't need this, he said. You've twisted everything, tried to humiliate me, and now you've got security ready to drag me out because I wouldn't bow. Sonny Hostin leaned in slightly, voice firm but composed. No one asked you to bow. We asked you to respect the platform. Crowder scoffed. This platform only respects people who agree with it. Everyone else gets painted as a villain. Whoopi's tone shifted, her voice now sharp and commanding. Stephen, this show has hosted Republicans, Libertarians, Independents, you name it. The difference is they came to talk. You came to perform. Crowder looked at her for a long moment. Then I guess my performance is over. The studio lights reflected in his eyes as he turned toward the wings. But before he left, he threw one last glare over his shoulder. Enjoy the ratings. And with that, the air snapped. The audience didn't cheer. They didn't boo. They just watched. Because everyone knew what they had just seen wasn't scripted. It was real, raw, and it wasn't finished yet. As Steven Crowder stepped off stage, the studio erupted, not with unified applause, but with chaos. One section of the audience booed loudly, shouting phrases like, "Get out," and "Don't come back." Others surprisingly clapped, not necessarily for Crowder, but perhaps for the spectacle itself. One man in the back yelled, "Finally someone says it," while another woman shouted back, "Yeah," and gets kicked for it. The room devolved into a live comment section, loud, divided, and emotionally volatile. Whoopi stood at the center of it all, shoulders squared, her expression steeled. That's what happens, she said almost to herself, when someone confuses provocation for conversation. Joy Behar exhaled hard, muttering, "Never again." Sonny stayed seated, pen tapping lightly against her notes. One of the producers rushed out from behind the curtain to whisper into Whoopi's ear, but she waved them off. She wanted the moment to breathe, to land. Because whether Crowder had stormed off or been pushed out, the message was clear. The View wasn't going to be hijacked. Backstage, cameras continued rolling. Staff scrambled to manage the social media feeds that were already exploding. Clips were going viral before Crowder even reached the building exit. Audience members whipped out their phones, uploading shaky footage of the final exchange. Hashtags began trending within minutes. Crowder vs The View, Whoopi Unfiltered. But on that studio floor, as the crew tried to reset for the next guest, it was clear nothing would be normal for the rest of the day. Not for the audience, not for the hosts, and definitely not for Crowder. As the studio settled into a stunned quiet, Whoopi Goldberg took the center of gravity back into her hands. She adjusted her seat, looked directly into camera 3 and spoke, not to the guest who had just exited, but to the viewers still glued to their screens. "We don't shy away from hard conversations here," she said, her voice steady. "But there's a difference between hard and hostile. What happened today wasn't about truth. It was about someone walking into a room and trying to burn it down. Joy Behar, still visibly tense, added, "He came here with the match in his hand. All we did was refuse to fan the flames." Sunny nodded quietly, scribbling notes, but her eyes flicked to Whoopi, silently deferring the final word. Whoopi leaned in just as slightly. "Let me be clear," she said. "There is room for disagreement on this show. There's not room for disrespect. Not to us, not to our audience, and not to the people whose stories are too often shouted down by the loudest voice in the room." The audience clapped, not wildly, but with firm agreement. The applause wasn't for a win, it was for a boundary, for a line that had been drawn and defended. Off camera, a production assistant gave the countdown to the next segment, but Whoopi ignored it. "We've been doing this a long time," she said, turning back to her co-hosts, "and we've seen a lot of storms blow through this table. But today reminded everyone that if you come in swinging, don't be surprised when we swing back." Backstage, Steven Crowder moved fast. He brushed past crew members, ignored the showrunner calling his name, and shoved open the green room door with more force than necessary. His team scrambled behind him, whispering damage control strategies, but Crowder was too heated to listen. "They ambushed me," he muttered, pacing the room. "They wanted a soundbite. They got it." One of his assistants attempted to calm him down, suggesting he post a preemptive video statement. "No," Crowder snapped. "I'll do it live, tonight." Down the hallway, a pair of producers exchanged hushed words. "We should have cut him sooner," one said. "No," the other replied, eyes still fixed on the monitors. "This clip will feed the internet for days." And it already had. Footage of the final blow-up had been clipped, uploaded, and shared across every major platform. On X, it trended within 20 minutes. On YouTube, fans and critics alike began dissecting every frame. The narrative was out of their hands now. Crowder was spinning it his way, and The View would spin it theirs. But on set, the tone was less calculated and more exhausted. Whoopi exhaled, finally letting her shoulders drop. "I'm done with that energy," she said. Sunny nodded. Joy muttered, "We need a drink after this." The segment was over, but no one celebrated. Crowder's chair sat empty, slightly askew. A silence lingered over the stage. Not regret, not victory. Just the quiet after a storm that had shaken the room and cracked the brand new veneer of controlled chaos. Minutes after Steven Crowder disappeared down the corridor, the backstage hallway lit up with rapid movement. Executives on phones, assistants juggling PR drafts, and security confirming he'd exited the building. One producer, still shaken, muttered, "Next time someone books a political grenade, I want to say." In the green room, a half-empty bottle of water sat next to Crowder's untouched notes, talking points never even used. A junior staffer stared at them, shaking her head. He didn't come to talk, he came to detonate. Down the hall, the showrunner gave a directive loud enough for the entire production team to hear. "Scrub the rest of the segment. Get him off the broadcast. I don't care how many clips go viral." Editors were already slicing footage, deciding what would make the afternoon reruns and what would stay buried in the vault. At the same time, publicists for The View drafted dual statements, one for official press, the other for damage control if Crowder spun the incident as censorship. Both versions would be needed. Meanwhile, Crowder was already in an SUV live streaming to his followers. "They kicked me out because I told the truth," he said into the camera. "They couldn't handle a real voice in their echo chamber." Back in the studio, Whoopi watched the clip play on a stagehand's phone and rolled her eyes. "He's not dangerous," she said. "He's predictable." But even she knew the headlines had already written themselves. Now it was no longer about who was right. It was about who controlled the story. And that battle had just begun. Within the hour, social media exploded. "You Habri," Crowder kicked off. "How are you, Whoop Iv's Crowder?" and "The View Meltdown" all trended globally. Clips circulated across every major platform, edited, remixed, spun for outrage or vindication. Conservative pundits rallied behind Crowder, calling it proof of media censorship. Progressive voices praised the host for standing their ground. News anchors and podcasters dissected every line, every glare, every pause. The internet had chosen its battlefield, and both sides came armed. Inside ABC's headquarters, executives huddled in emergency PR meetings. The network's legal team reviewed the segment frame by frame, weighing the risk of litigation versus rating spikes. "We could lose advertisers," one exec warned, "or gain 5 million views," another countered. The press office released a carefully worded statement within hours. "The View remains committed to diverse voices and civil dialogue. Unfortunately, today's discussion did not meet that standard." Vague, neutral, designed to cool the firestorm, but it only added fuel. Meanwhile, late-night shows jumped on the chaos. Comedians riffed off the blowout while political commentators debated whether this was a cultural flashpoint or a cheap ratings grab. Inside the industry, producers took notes. "Book controversy, but control it," one talk show host reportedly said during their morning meeting. Even rival networks started circling, some seeing Crowder's clash as ammunition, others as a lesson. But no matter the angle, one truth remained. The spectacle had already outgrown the studio. It was no longer just an interview, it was a reckoning, and the ripples were just beginning. In the days that followed, the dust refused to settle. Think pieces filled editorial pages, podcasts devoted entire episodes to the incident, and former talk show hosts weighed in with their own war stories. The Views panel returned the next morning, measured, composed, but clearly still navigating the fallout. Whoopi addressed the elephant in the room. Yesterday wasn't about left or right, it was about conduct. There's a way to disagree without setting fire to the room. The audience applauded, but the tension hadn't fully lifted. Crowder, meanwhile, leaned into the narrative. He released a video titled "Silenced on the View," claiming the confrontation proved how far mainstream media would go to muzzle dissent. His supporters cheered him as a martyr of free speech, while critics called it another manufactured meltdown for clicks. Both camps flooded comment sections, political blogs, and newsrooms with opinions and accusations. Advertisers took notice, some pulling out, others doubling down depending on the audience they hoped to court. The entire industry paused to watch and to recalculate what kind of truth audiences were really hungry for. So what do you think? Was Steven Crowder justified in standing his ground, or did Whoopi Goldberg and the hosts simply refuse to let their show be hijacked? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button and tell us who you want covered next. Because in Hollywood, there's always another clash coming, and we'll be here to bring you every explosive detail.